So, good evening, everybody. I want to just welcome you to our second meeting of the fall and welcome everybody. My name is Ann Lesser, for those of you who don't know me, and I am the president of New York City Lera. We have a great program tonight and it's an hour long, so I don't want to take up too much time. So I am going to hand you over to the vice president of our chapter, Bill Herbert, who's going to be moderating tonight's program.
Hi, and thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'm a distinguished lecturer at Hunter College, along with being the vice president of the New York City Lera chapter. Those unfamiliar with Lera, it's a national organization originally founded in 1947, includes representatives of labor, management, government, academics, and neutrals. We encourage you to consider joining our chapter and getting involved. Our chapter's next virtual meeting will be on December 7th with a panel examining climate change and the future of workers with Mijan Shea, Lara Skinner, and Todd Vachon. Our Lera chapter discussion today is about the labor policies we might expect from the new mayoral administration of Eric Adams. Let me now introduce you to our distinguished panel. BASIL SMIKLE Jr. is one of my colleagues at Hunter College. He holds the titles of Distinguished Lecturer and Public Policy Program Director at the Roosevelt House Institute of Public Policy. He regularly shares his insights on electoral politics, governance, and public policy on national media outlets such as MSNBC, CNN, and Bloomberg TV. BARKAN is an award-winning journalist, a former candidate for office, and a columnist for the Guardian and Jacobin, as well as a contributing writer to The Nation. He's the author of The Prince, Andrew Cuomo, Coronavirus, and the Fall of New York. Richard Steyer is the editor of The Chief Leader and has spent over 3 decades working for that paper. He's also a former labor columnist and the City Hall reporter for the New York Post. His newspaper was featured in today's New York Times journalism column by Ben Smith, describing the future of the chief leader. The panelists will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll be opening up the discussion for questions. Please place your questions in the chat with a capital Q, and we hope to get to all the questions. During his campaign, Eric Adams emphasized his inspiring biography. Raised in Queens by a single mom, victimized by police brutality as a teenager, and went on to join the NYPD, rising to become a police captain. There he founded 100 Blacks in law enforcement who care. Following his retirement, he was elected as a state senator, serving from 2006 to 2013 before becoming elected for president. Upon his inauguration, Adams will be the first former municipal union member to become mayor, the second African-American to hold that office, and certainly the first vegan to run New York City. During the campaign, Adams received early endorsements from SEIU 32BJ, DC 37, Hotel Trades Council, TWU Local 100, and many others. In accepting the endorsement from DC 37, now Mayor-elect Adams stated, quote, "We need a blue-collar mayor to run a blue-collar city and respect the people of the city. We've had enough white-collar mayors treating us as insignificant." Similarly, he described himself as, quote, "just a blue-collar guy," end quote, "who knows what you want," when he received the endorsement of 32BJ. Since the election, Adams stated on MSNBC that he was going to be a GSD mayor, get stuff done, and announced his plan on using technology to end dysfunction in the provision of city services. His transition team is being led by United Way CEO Sheena Wright, and it has been reported that 32BJ's Kyle Bragg, Hotel Trades Council President Rich Morado, Ford Foundation Darren Walker, and CUNY Chancellor Felix Matos Rodriguez will be among the transition team's co-chairs. At the same time, some have raised concerns about Adams' failure to identify a, quote, big idea, end quote, that he wants to accomplish as mayor, as well as his lack of executive experience and his visits to the exclusive members-only Zero Bond Club in NoHo, where he held his election night victory party and has subsequently met there with major business figures. So the first question I have for our 3 panelists are the following. One, how will Eric Adams' life experiences and strong labor union support during the campaign shape his administration's labor policies? Basil, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Good evening, everyone, first and foremost, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel. One of the things that I've been saying about Eric is that he, interestingly enough, and in a way that was sort of unexpected given that at the beginning of the campaign, ran as a bit of a law and order candidate. And I say that because very early in the campaign cycle, the narrative was about building New York back. So we were talking about jobs, we were talking about construction. For full disclosure, I was managing one of the mayoral candidates, one of his opponents, Ray McGuire, in that cycle. But there was a lot of conversation about growth and bringing New York back and jobs and building affordable housing, and the construction required to turn empty offices into affordable housing or housing for folks who are homeless. The narrative of the race quickly turned to crime and quality of life, which sort of fell right into Eric's lap as the former police officer. And but in truth and in fact, outside of the blip by Andrew Yang, he never really fell out of contention. He never really fell out of sort of the top tier or first or second place among all the candidates. And I think at one point there were 20 something initially. So it just says to me that he does. You're right. He didn't really campaign on a big idea like universal pre-K that Bill de Blasio did. But I sense that he will continue a pro-growth mantra and agenda. I do think that he will be a law and order mayor to some extent, and he said as much in his victory speech on election night. And the fact that I think that yes, he got a lot of labor support, but you know what? Front runners get a lot of support from labor. They do, and he's been an elected official since 2006 when he was in the Senate. So I know that he's established a lot of strong relationships with labor. What remains to be seen is whether or not, because he didn't really speak on this in tremendous detail during the campaign, will he for the growth that he wants, will he sacrifice labor to do it, organize labor to do it? And that's really what we haven't seen. Quite frankly, I don't know that we know that much about his intentions. But I will say that he, like many politicians, is very loyal and appreciates loyalty. And the fact that many unions, the ones that did come out for him early, I imagine that he will have an open door policy.
Thank you. Ross, BARKAN, what's your view about the impact of Eric Adams' life experiences of strong labor support will have in shaping his labor policies?
So it's really interesting because Eric Adams won the primary with the strong support of several very prominent labor unions. He won with the endorsements of DC 37, with the Hotel Trades Council, with 32BJ. He, of course, as he has said, is the first mayor ever to be who was part of a rank and file of a union, when he was in the in the captain's union as a police captain. So that's quite significant. So he's certainly someone who, unlike Michael Bloomberg, another candidate who kind of ran as more kind of a pro-business, pro-real estate sort of campaign, he has ties to labor, and he takes labor seriously, and he's not simply going to be out to undermine labor or not settle contracts or be an antagonist, which Bloomberg was at times, and at times could be accommodating. I think what's also interesting about Adams is it depends on the union, right? Because he had the strong support of some unions when it comes to education. He's been at odds with the UFT, being very supportive of the charter sector. So in that sense, he's not pro-labor on education, because the education side of labor is very much opposed to charter schools. And then, in other areas, I think that's a real open question where the interests of real estate, for example, may run in opposition of the interests of labor. Sometimes they don't. The building trades unions work closely with the real estate industry, with REBNY. Other times they haven't, and they've been at odds. And that's a real question, because Eric Adams, in sort of a very interesting way, has courted a wide range of figures. He's someone who has the support of Bill de Blasio, who is a pretty pro-union mayor. He has the support of Michael Bloomberg. He's friends with Rupert Murdoch, who of course is not a pro-labor figure by any means. And the real estate and business elites of the city are very welcoming to Eric Adams and very excited about him. And their interests do not always align with the interests of the municipal unions. Eric Adams will have people whispering in his ear who tell him the city workforce is too big and too bloated. You have to pare it back, and Bill de Blasio let it all run amok. And you, Eric Adams, will have to come in and be the technocrat who right sizes government. Again, I'm using their language. At the same time, he's someone who won with the support of labor. So when will the interests of a business or real estate elite run up against the interests of a DC 37, for example? And that to me is an open question and a very interesting one. And Eric Adams has not really defined his labor agenda very extensively beyond the fact that he has said he's going to be a pro-labor mayor. Remember when Bill de Blasio won, the big issue is those outstanding contracts, the contracts that elapsed, and Bill de Blasio basically had to come into office and settle a whole host of municipal contracts. And we're in a slightly different environment now, but I think it's very much an open question in regards to what Eric Adams will do. And the word I always use is unpredictability. With him, with the new city council, there are just a lot of variables we have not seen before. And the politics of the city, I think, are probably going to be more polarized than they've been in a while. And you're going to have a lot of different politicians with their own power bases, with their own degrees of clout. Adams is one of them, but there are also many others. And the governor's race also is that wild card which will be hanging over the city next year. And that all leads to, again, this reality of unpredictability that for all we know, and for all we know about Adams's strange political history and very interesting one, there's still much that we are going to learn very soon and we can't quite predict.
So Richard, you want to lay out for us where things stand regarding municipal collective bargaining, and what do you think is going to be Adams' approach in light of his life story?
Well, I mean, essentially just about every major union contract and a bunch of minor ones is going to expire at some point during 2022. You also have a situation right now with the Police Benevolent Association, the largest of the police unions. Their contract actually expired August 1st, 2017. They are getting ready in about 3 weeks to go into an arbitration proceeding that is going to still be going when Adams takes office. The last couple of hearings are scheduled for the second week in January. They are looking to do better than any of the other unions did in contracts negotiated with Bill de Blasio as part of that arbitration. At the same time, Adams has said on a couple of occasions during the campaign that he was going to give emergency medical technicians parity with police and firefighters. Right now, they fall considerably below them in terms of maximum salary, and that's the case even after a contract deal was reached in September, in which the union agreed to have people work longer hours and participate in a program the city has where it's substituting EMTs and social workers for police in dealing with what are considered nonviolent, emotionally disturbed persons. And so they still have a lot of ground to make up. And the city has always been ruled by pattern bargaining. There have been some variations along the way, but by and large, it's been very traditional that way ever since the city got burned in the early 1970s by instances in which they let one union do better than another union. That union would go to arbitration and would leapfrog over them. And in the long run, the city was paying the price for it. And so that they looked to get things more or less regulated, where if they struck a pattern, that there was not going to be a whole lot of deviation once that pattern was set in terms of what they were agreeing to with other unions. So the question becomes, how much are you going to realistically be able to give the EMTs? And this applies not just in relation to cops and firefighters, it also applies to DC 37, which happens to represent the two EMS unions, the one for officers as well as the one for EMTs and paramedics, and basically is not looking to take money out of the pockets of its other members in order to fund an EMT contract. So there are all those questions. There is also the question of the city's financial condition. Right now, the estimated deficit for the fiscal year that starts July 1st, 6 months into Adams' term, is somewhere around 4.1 billion. That could grow. And once you've got that kind of nut to make up, it limits what you're going to be able to offer unions in collective bargaining. And so that becomes another source of potential tension down the line. And it can be a problem for even mayors who were thought of as progressive and pro-labor. And that was the case when David Dinkins became mayor in 1990 and gave a raise to teachers that some people thought was excessive. And a couple of days later, had the city's credit rating lowered and also had to announce that he was postponing the hiring of more police officers during a year in which the city set a record for murders. So it's something that even progressive mayors are governed to some degree by what the budget will permit and what some of the various watchdogs are going to say if they see you stepping outside of the parameters of that budget. It doesn't mean he won't try, because Ross is right. He has a certain unpredictability to him where he's not like anyone who's preceded him, I don't think. But that's still to be determined.
So Basil, one of your areas of expertise is education policy. Who do you anticipate will be Adams' choice for DOE chancellor, and how do you think that appointment will impact relations with the UFT and DC 37?
Well, just to say for the record, another hat that I wear is that I'm on the board of the New York City Charter Center, so I'm a charter school supporter. I feel like I'm going to be doing a lot of disclaimers and such this evening, but so the person who seems to be the front runner, if you will, or his choice for schools chancellor is a guy named David Banks, and I know David. I've known David for at least 20 years now, probably a little more. And one of the ways in which I know him is I helped start the Eagle Academy, which is started as a high school in the Bronx and is now 6 schools, and one in each borough and another in Newark. And he was the founding principal of that first school. So we've worked together quite a bit over the years. And my sense of Eric and David, so I'll answer the question this way. You know, Eric has voiced some support for charters, as was mentioned earlier. David is, yes, a charter supporter, but that's not sort of his go-to. His go-to is trying to arrange and work with grassroots educators for support for traditional public schools, and then alternatives to the traditional public school that don't necessarily involve charters. I say that because if you look at Eagle Academy, it is exactly that. It is a public single-sex school, not charter. The law does not allow for that anymore. The Women's Leadership Academy was sort of the first such school in decades, many, many decades, in the city, and Eagle sort of took that blueprint and sort of did something similar. So you're not able to open up that type of school anymore, but I know that he's been very active in organizing grassroots interests, parent organizers, education advocates that are really looking for alternatives to, in curriculum and school setting, alternatives to traditional public schooling that are themselves not charters. So I do think you'll see a lot of that kind of innovation on the ground, or at least attempts to do so. The challenge is maybe a strong word, but I think one of the things that Eric is going to be confronted with very early on is that the charter cap has not been lifted. And that really is when you think about, Ross talked about the governor's race, Kathy being there, she's getting challenged by Tish, potentially Jumaane Williams, both of who are going to take progressive lanes to some varying degree, maybe even the current mayor and Bill de Blasio. there's a more progressive state legislature, more progressive New York City Council. What will be the legislative environment to raise the cap, even as Kathy Hochul is somewhat supportive and Eric Adams is somewhat supportive? That's really where I think you may see some tension, because clearly there are significant interests and advocates behind the raising of the cap. And even if it's not in this significantly, but it is the mechanism through which the charter sector can grow. So I think you'll see some early conversation around that, but I don't know that you'll see early action because of those political forces that I mentioned.
What about the issue of mayoral control, DOE? Do you think that's going to be something that's behind on Eric Adams' priority list?
Sure, I don't see him relinquishing authority at all. The question is, what is the legislature going to want something for it? And what are they going to want for it? Maybe they want a de-emphasizing, and let me speak on this for a bit. What they may want a de-emphasizing of charters in the education landscape. And what I mean by that is, when you look at Mike Bloomberg, he had what they call a portfolio management model of schools. So you had traditional public schools, charter schools, small schools, experimental schools, just a whole host of different types of education examples of schooling that were being managed out of City Hall. One of the other important features other than charters was the rapid closing and reopening of small schools, which were which were tremendously contentious. And then we've, certainly in the de Blasio years, he ran against the Bloomberg strategies for education, clawed back a lot of the expansion of charter schools, stopped the rapid closing of schools, but then had to deal with some big issues of his own, like gifted and talented programs and the deep-seated resegregation of New York City public schools. And of course, the other thing that's sort of not been dealt with, and that is the specialized high schools. So I think Eric inherits those pieces, but I think I imagine he's gonna ask for mayoral control because he wants to be able to do, fulfill his vision, certainly David's vision. The question is, what is the state legislature going to ask for it? And it may come in the form of rethinking getting into how you get into specialized high schools, the gifted and talented programs. So.
You mentioned earlier about Adams with regard to the police department. And I'm just curious, in light of his pragmatism and experiences, what do you think his approach is going to be with regard to police discipline? Certainly a labor issue and a very controversial one where progressives, even though police discipline is a prohibited subject in New York, some progressives think that police should not have unions. So just curious, what do you think Adams' approach to police discipline, particularly regarding brutality, will be applied? What do you think his approach is going to be?
Well, I think he's going to be, look, his base is not going, rightly or wrongly, his base is going to look at him as an African-American mayor to be tough on police discipline. The thing is, he also ran on being tough on crime. So if you think back to Dinkins, in the later years of his administration, he was getting tougher on crime. And he was quite vocal about it. And we started to see crime go down under his administration. He didn't win re-election, so Giuliani was able to take that, build on it, and run with it. So it'll be interesting to see how this Black Democrat deals with being tough on crime without alienating his base. Having said that, one of the really interesting conversations that has taken place post Tuesday's elections is the extent to which Democrats embrace and or entertain progressive policies and the language around those policies, like defunding police, as you mentioned, because Democrats up and down have, will say publicly but most privately that this is hurting hurting us at the ballot. And it is the case that executives tend to be the more moderate, right? The progressives can be elected in the legislature. It's hard for a progressive today to win as an executive. Buffalo is an interesting case in point, right? And so even though she did win the primary. So I think he, being the former police officer, being a captain, he'll certainly be able to speak the language of the NYPD. Whether or not he decides to be more heavy-handed than his predecessor in his approach to disciplining police, or his predecessor is in disciplining police, it remains to be seen. I imagine that he will, because his base is going to want it. And I don't know that he'll have a very successful term, whether he gets reelected or not. I imagine he will. But he'll have, to me, a tumultuous term if he does not tip his hat in that direction. But that's where the rubber meets the road. He's going to have to figure out a way to be tough on crime, improve quality of life, but also be able to discipline police in a way that we haven't seen in some time.
Ross, what's your view about Adams and his approach to running the police department, and also with regard to police discipline, and also what impact that may have in terms of his administration's relationship with the PBA?
Well, I think that.
Oh, who goes? Is it me or Richard?
That was for me, or? Oh,
I'm sorry.
For me.
Why did Ross go first and Richard follow?
Sure.
Okay. So in terms of Adams's relationship with the police, so he came up as certainly both a reformer and an agitator from within the department. He was not as a police captain and as someone who ran a very well-known and confrontational reform movement. Adams was not someone who was popular with police brass. And certainly if you ask someone in the 1990s in the police department, who was more of a conservative or someone, closer leadership, should this guy, Eric Adams, be mayor, they would say no. So Adams definitely comes at this on one hand, very much from this like insider outsider lane of, he was very much someone agitating for reform within the department. He's not your prototypical like law and order type of mayor, someone who like Giuliani, who really stormed to victory on the back of white backlash, and also, a very different era, and very much had this at the very center of who he was. Adams is a bit more complicated, but of course, he also ran a campaign that centered crime, cracking down on crime, being against the defund the police movement, very much stressed his law and order credentials. So when it comes to his relationships with the PBA, I think it'll be complex. And something we saw at Bill de Blasio is a mayor can be conciliatory toward the PBA and do a lot for the PBA and really get nothing back in return. Of course, there are 5 police unions that the PBA is one we think of. But I covered de Blasio and saw this again and again. There was the narrative that de Blasio hates the police. He's this radical leftist. And it was not true. Really, he's proposing and trying to implement fairly mild reforms, reducing stop and frisks, which actually started to go down under Bloomberg. And there was a general consensus that you didn't need stop and frisk to arrest crime. And it was true. Crime continued to plummet as the number of stop and frisks declined. And de Blasio, himself actually hired more police. Over 1,000 new police officers were hired under a fairly progressive city council. And really, after his first year, he went out of his way to accommodate police leadership and rank and file in the department. He sided with the police repeatedly in clashes. Certainly, when it came to the protests around George Floyd in 2020, it did not matter. The police unions had formed a narrative that he was a cop-hating mayor, and there was really little chance for significant reform. And I think that was one of the failures of the de Blasio years. And with Adams, I don't know. I don't know how far he's going to push them. I think on one hand, the police unions have less leverage than they used to. I think because of the political right turn they've taken, Pat Lynch endorsing Donald Trump to me was a signal that the PBA doesn't have the juice with most of the people who vote in Democratic primaries in New York City, whereas at one point they had a great amount of juice. And I think you saw from the two city council races I was watching very closely, where the PBA invested very heavily in conservative Democrats, and they lost them both. They lost in Southern Brooklyn to a Republican, and they lost with South Albany's also to a Republican. So what those races to me showed was that, even in conservative districts where the PBA's imprimatur should be everything in the world, partisan polarization overwhelmed it. So I don't think we're going to be in a world where the police unions have as much clout as they used to, where they can just simply scare Eric Adams. At the same time, Eric Adams has not really been very specific on the type of reforms he would pursue at the department. Again, a lot of generalities. How, Richard can probably speak far more about this when it comes to labor law, but it's very hard to dismiss a police officer for something that they've done wrong, as we saw with Daniel Pantaleo. That is what unions do. And yes, there is this kind of robust debate on the left about police unions. I'd say one side of the debate says we have to defend police unions like all organized labor because they are part of the labor movement, and the other says no, they are defending capital and they are somewhat separate from the labor movement. And this debate's actually quite old and dates back, almost 100 years. But for now, police unions very much exist and they're very strong, and laws are laws. So I'm not convinced that a lot is going to change under Adams when it comes to the department versus de Blasio. My guess would be you're going to have some continuity where he appoints a police commissioner who is going to get a great amount of deference, like Ray Kelly got under Bloomberg, like Bill Bratton got under de Blasio, then O'Neill and Shea, and the NYPD will continue to exist as its own fiefdom. And you may see some moderate pushes toward reform, but nothing greatly dramatic. And I think if Adams does try to push further in the direction of reform, the unions will get very loud. And at that point, the question will be, will their loudness intimidate Adams? It very much intimidated de Blasio. Adams is different. He was in the force himself. And he may look at the political wins and say, well, I actually, as both a black man and a former police captain, I can stand up to the police unions in a way Bill de Blasio could not. And that could be a very interesting dynamic. But again, these things have a habit of revealing themselves. Like Eric Garner, which was entirely unexpected, right? The sudden death brought a lot of these issues into relief for de Blasio in his very first year. Will there be a tragedy or some sort of controversial moment like Garner that again brings these issues to the fore? Will you have police killings of police, like with Wen Jianlu and Ramos also in 2014? And that was the moment where de Blasio, in my mind, really retreated from any mission of sweeping police reform. We're going to see, right? We don't know. And I think with Adams, that's really the operative word. We don't quite know yet.
So Richard, you mentioned before the pending police interest arbitration. And as we know, police discipline is prohibited subject to interest arbitration. So it can't be negotiated, it can't be really discussed. Question is, how do you see the potential for Adams making changes to police disciplinary procedures, how that may impact the current interest arbitration, and what do you think is going to be likely to take place with a very big budget deficit and this other lurking issue involving police reform?
Well, one of the more provocative things that Adams has said is that he is going to take away the power of the police commissioner to be the final disciplinary authority, that he's going to be the final disciplinary authority. If he manages to do that, then it's going to be a very difficult type of situation for the unions to have to deal with, because one of the things they're concerned about, it's not that they see Adams as more progressive than de Blasio, but I think there was a cop who I was speaking to last week who said de Blasio was wishy-washy. Adams seems like someone who's going to be more effective and is going to get things done. And that means that if he decides that he wants to get tough, then he is not going to back off because of any police rallies outside of Gracie Mansion or elsewhere. That he is someone, though, who is more nuanced than a lot of people give him credit for, that you could look at it in microcosm in terms of the difference between him and Maya Wiley during the debates over stop and frisk. Wiley's supposed to be the intellectual. Adams is supposed to be the guy who acts from the gut. And yet he was giving more complex explanations for why stop and frisk is a useful tool if it's executed under the Constitution than Wiley was in talking about why it was horrible and had to be done away with. I mean, one reason that this became relevant again was that at a certain point, people were wondering whether the rise in crime that began last year and has continued this year was partly because cops were not doing stop and frisks anymore. And when they are done for real, as opposed to meet a quota, you can get guns off the street that way. That's why he's been talking about bringing back the anti-crime unit. On the other hand, he has said, and he did it in his election night speech, that he is going to get rid of cops who are brutal, that they are not going to have any place in his department. I mean, it's one of the measures of just how hapless de Blasio was in terms of picking his spots, that he was harsher on Sergeant Hugh Barry for a shooting in a split-second situation with an emotionally disturbed woman than he ever was with Daniel Pantaleo in the aftermath of that situation, as well as the cops who were just standing around not doing anything in terms of getting first aid for Garner when he was lying there unconscious, or making a sense of urgency apparent when paramedics belatedly showed up, that they were treating it like no biggie. And that was something that a mayor who was a little bit more certain of himself would have let them have it on. And so that it is going to be one of these things. Is he going to look at it as a black man who happens to be mayor? Perhaps to some degree, but he is also informed by what happened during his 22 years on the job, and he understands the situations in which a cop had the discretion, had the opportunity to take another course rather than using force, and the ones in which it's much tougher to second guess because it's a split-second reaction. And you may say that it was the wrong decision, but it's still a matter of life and death. And you'll have a situation, you had one out in Queens where a cop hesitated in terms of dealing with an emotionally disturbed man in Jamaica a few years ago and got hit in the head with a hatchet and was seriously injured as a result of that. So, that it is something where he understands what it's like to be in the job, and he knows what is definitely wrong, but it's also something where he's going to understand in situations where it may look bad to the public, and any physical fracas is going to look bad. It's going to look messy because these guys are not professional boxers. They aren't people who are going to shoot the gun out of the guy's hand rather than aiming center mass, because that's a good way to get yourself killed. But and one other thing that he understands is that he has the power to reshape the department, but ultimately he has to stand behind the cops when he thinks that they're right. That you had a situation last year in terms of the cutting of $1 billion from the budget, but more so in terms of the diaphragm compression bill that he signed a couple of weeks later, where he said it was against the advice of all his police commanders, but he felt that they had to honor the moment and that he had to sign it into law. Well, that was basically just playing to the progressive grandstand. I mean, that's something that was making cops' jobs harder, and it was also making law enforcement more difficult, that situations in which two cops might handle an arrest suddenly were situations where cops were going to be summoning backups, and sometimes they wouldn't go with just 4 cops on the scene. They would go with 6, because that way everybody could grab an arm and you'd be able to get the guy immobilized without having to get anywhere near their torso. It's not smart. And fortunately for de Blasio, a judge basically threw out that law, and so that it's just sitting there in limbo, that Adams understands what is necessary and what isn't, that a chokehold ban was very much in order, that it should have been in place a long time ago, going back to the 94 case with Francis Lavodi and Anthony Baez. But it was not until you finally had this thing passed, and it was being passed at a time of the George Floyd protests, and you had a councilman who quickly moved on when he got a job with Governor Cuomo, but he decided, hey, let's go for the gusto and throw in the compression bill. I mean, that just was not smart in terms of trying to get police restrained, but still giving them the leverage to be able to do their jobs.
Can I just add something very quickly, because Richard reminded me of something, and I just very quickly, I remember the moment, and I think it was when those two officers were killed in their car. I think it was that moment, and de Blasio was in the hospital, and he was talking about his son. It was whatever moment when he was talking about his son, and then he has a conversation with his son, and he tells his son to be afraid of the police. And what I found to be interesting, as we all know now, his son is African American. I always said to myself in that moment that he did not finish the arc of that narrative. Yes, I had this talk with my son about the police, but what I found interesting is that he never stood up for them as their boss. The police officers that are his employees, and whatever issues he has with them, he needs to at some point be able to articulate some kind of support for the work that they do as his employees. And he never really finished that arc of that story. And I always felt like that was the moment, and there are probably others, but that was a key moment where a police officer said, we're done. If you're just gonna go tell your kids to be afraid of us, then what it was sort of on and popping from their point of view. And it's important to note the sort of thing that the theme that we're acknowledging, that Eric Adams is a much more nuanced politician. And even on something like quality of life, where an increase in crime, where some people blame bail reform on that was championed by Latrice Monique Walker from his own borough in the Assembly. And that's kind of indicative of the line he's got to walk in the nuance. You have someone from his borough who's a strong supporter of this very progressive measure that people are blaming on the increase in crime. And he's going to have to find a way to sort of navigate his base, not just citywide, but even within his home borough.
And since the election, the mayor-elect has been talking about redesigning city services, ending dysfunction within city services, imposing new technologies. A lot of that sounds very familiar from the past, which involved the efforts to redesign government, which led to proposals and imposition of privatization and other matters, all of which are required negotiations, which raises a question which I'd like each of you to discuss is, what do you think Eric Adams will be bringing to the table in terms of style with regard to collective bargaining and the reality of the requirements of the law of negotiations, of good faith negotiations over a lot of things he may want to impose, but he cannot legally do so unilaterally. In terms of his self-assuredness and also being a blue-collar mayor, how do you think he's going to respond to these limitations established under collective bargaining rules?
I'll take that one if nobody wants to go first. I mean, I think one thing that's going to be very significant is who he chooses as his labor commissioner. That right now you have Renee Campion, who basically had been a top aide to Bob Lynn. She has been in charge for the greater part of the last 3 years. Prior to that, there was a 35-year period in which you had two men serving as labor commissioner for some very different mayors. You had Bob Lynn doing it for the last 6 years of Ed Koch's term and for the first 5 years of de Blasio's term. And you had Jim Hanley with a couple of breaks doing it for David Dinkins and for Rudy Giuliani and for Michael Bloomberg. And in terms of their style, these were very conventional types of negotiators who very much swore by pattern bargaining. When Dinkins was first elected, he chose Eric Schmertz, who was more liberal than typical people, but more to the point, was an arbitrator rather than someone who had ever done any negotiating in his life. And he managed to bungle the first negotiation that he had, and it set back Dinkins for a while, that basically they needed to bring in Hanley to get things straightened out. And so you can take someone who you may think is an innovator or someone who thinks outside the box, but if they are not mindful of the delicate relationships that exist among the city's unions, they can wind up creating more problems for you than they are going to solve problems.
I'll just say very quickly, when I do know that Eric Adams has been working on is trying to have a stronger relationship with Wall Street and with the business community. He said as much in his victory speech. He said that he would essentially have an open door policy with the business community. And people saw that as a bit of a dig to the current mayor who did not engage with the business community. But I do know that he's been working tirelessly and engaging a lot of folks to try to get Wall Street and the business community broadly to have more of a role at City Hall. Again, I don't know what that does in terms of, I don't know that he makes the choice between, significant growth versus, making sure that folks have a living wage, for example. But it will be interesting to see, again, how he balances those two things. Because I've never really believed the blue collar narrative. I mean, I get it, but I've never really fully believed it. But if that is important to him in terms of how he views governance going forward, that's a credential he's going to have to be careful of being able to sustain if he doesn't maintain those significant relationships with labor and make sure that that the growth that he's talking about is inclusive and not exclusive.
Ross, your thoughts on
for collective bargaining, it's a good question, and I think that we're going to see how much it departs from the de Blasio approach, where I thought it was interesting what Richard said about the view of him as wishy-washy. And I mean, the interesting thing is de Blasio did settle the contracts fairly quickly, and he had Bob Lynn doing it. So he did deputize someone with a lot of experience very early on to handle all these municipal contracts. Who will Adams deputize? Who's going to work in the Adams administration? Obviously, there should be a long line of people because it is a new mayor, and it is a Democratic administration, and it should be able to attract people. But that's an open question where I'm really waiting to see who Eric Adams's top aides are beyond the people we know. He has a chief of staff who's carrying over from his borough presidency. He has allies from the city council who are probably going to have jobs in the administration. There's Frank Carone, who will be very influential, the de facto head of the Brooklyn Democratic Party. But when it comes to labor and a lot of other things, who are the people who are going to be the faces of that administration? I don't know. And what kind of style will Adams have? Also an open question, because we've seen a lot of different Eric Adamses. We've seen the combative, incendiary Eric Adams. We've seen Eric Adams from his state Senate days, where he's shouting on the floor of the state Senate about not getting a pay raise. We've seen him befriending Hiram Montserrat and sort of being a chaos agent in the state legislature. We've also seen the canny operator Eric Adams too, someone who is comfortable in rooms with a lot of different people and has had a knack for forging alliances. But with him, really him versus other politicians, there's always that unpredictable variable where you don't quite know what he's going to say. You don't quite know what he's going to think. You don't quite know how he's going to approach a situation. And this is a big job. Eric Adams has not held, and this is true to de Blasio to an extent too, has never held a job remotely like this one. The borough presidency, and apologies to the people who like borough presidents, but it's something of a pretend job, right? We know since the end of the Board of Estimate, the borough presidents are very ceremonial. One could abolish them and not much would change in the city. So it's been 8 years of sort of picking and choosing your own issues off a menu, reacting to news cycles, right? And becoming mayor is very different. The borough presidency, kind of like the public advocate's role, it's a role that has no real power in the city and could probably disappear, and few would notice. And so you're really talking about someone, has some experience in the legislature, though not a lot of experience. And obviously the most depth that he has is coming out of the police department. And that's really where his ideology was forged. That's where he learned to be, in some ways, a politician. It's where he learned to make relationships, to wield power, where, he got a real sense of the city in a great way. But mayor is very different. And I and a lot of others are really waiting to see who does he surround himself with, because that's the key. Bill de Blasio, to his credit, ultimately surrounded himself, at least in the early years, with some rather sober-minded veteran bureaucrats, whether it's Dean Foulahan, Bob Lynn, Carl Weisbrod, Alicia Glenn, people who had really long track records, either in city government or working around it. And Eric Adams very well may assemble his own cabinet of similar type bureaucrats who sort of trend a little left, but not really very left, but have kind of that deep experience in the permanent government, for lack of a better word. And who are Adams's people? I don't know. I don't really know. And I think we're going to find out.
We have a question about city policy in the private sector with regard to minimum wage and also discrimination issues, which also includes the public sector. So the question I have for our panelists is, what do you anticipate Eric Adams will be doing regarding staffing and funding of city agencies like the Office of Labor Policy and Standards and the New York City Commission on Human Rights? The latter agency has been subject to expansions and contractions during the different political cycles, and I'd be curious to know what you think Adams is his approach to those two agencies, the Office of Labor Policy and Standards and the City Commission on Human Rights, will be once he's inaugurated. Okay, let's change it slightly. We have over the past 8 years, there have been a number of changes by the City Council on labor policy for the private sector. A number of laws have passed, amending the administrative code on the areas of discrimination, expanding the scope of protected categories. The Office of Labor Policy and Standards have given authority over rules and regulations regarding retail workers, fast food workers, and freelancers. What can we expect from the Adams administration to expand on that or to contract on that with respect to more progressive labor policies?
I would say that it's not necessarily something you can anticipate until you see who he puts in those jobs, who's in charge of running those offices or enforcing those laws. If he's making political hires, then chances are not that much is going to change. If he's bringing in people who actually know what's wrong, understand the law, and can make good on enforcement, then you're going to see something significant happen. And so it's really going to come down to who is he appointing, because chances are that will give you some sense as to the mandate that he's giving them.
Something I'll add to that too, I think it's a really good point, sort of to address both questions, is Eric Adams actually comes into office with more political support than de Blasio did, in the sense that there are a lot more just individual politicians and people who are supporting Adams in his primary than with de Blasio, where de Blasio entered office owing very few favors to like individual city council members, legislators, to the outer borough Democratic parties. Bill de Blasio had no endorsements from any of the outer borough parties. So I think, to Richard's point, right, is it going to be a patronage appointee running an agency, or kind of a bureaucrat with a long history of doing stuff, right? Is your DOT commissioner going to be a Polly Trottenberg type person who's now with the federal DOT, or is it going to be Donis Rodriguez? And, you know, no shade thrown at Adonis, but he's a politician. He's not someone with 20, 30 years of transit background, right? And I think that's true with human rights. That's true of a lot of these things. Who's going to be there running it? Will it be, you know, like in the Bloomberg years where agency heads were given broad leeway to implement their own policy? You know, Bloomberg would bring in these agency heads who had become quite well known in their own right, whether it's at Parks, Adrian Benepi, Janique Sadak Khan at DOT, right? These are people who built very broad portfolios and really were deputized to do a lot, you know, mostly for better, sometimes for ill. And then de Blasio, for the most part, had serious people running city agencies, not really patronage type people. He was more of a micromanager, and that was sort of one of the big knocks on de Blasio, is he really would try to intervene in very aggressive ways, and also did not always want to delegate. And that's an issue. You know, good leaders do delegate. You know, what sort of leader will Adams be? Will Adams really empower people, experts, to do things, you know, under the guidance of Adams, or, you know, will he bring in more patronage style, you know, agency heads? We don't know. You know, there are a lot of political interests who were with Eric Adams and who are going to want to have their loyalty rewarded. That is politics. What form does that take? That's an open question.
Yeah, if I can piggyback on the piggyback, you know, that's a big question for me. You know, Bill de Blasio came into office thinking he had a much bigger mandate than he really did. And I'm not sure if Adams feels differently, but he does. He did have a strong win, and he, you know, that's something that I don't think he's going to let us forget. And you know, in the somewhat meritocratic style of Mike Bloomberg, in hiring people like a Sean Donovan and others that you mentioned, Ross, you know, who have gone on to federal government and such. There is a sort of detachment, if you will, that Bloomberg had from folks. I'm not to say that he didn't manage them, but my point is that he hired really strong people in these agencies and let them go do what they did. I don't know that Eric Adams will do that. He doesn't come across as the person that will be that detached, at least not in the early days. He seemed like he would be a lot more hands-on. And in terms of the hires, it is interesting. I mean, particularly when you think about Black politics, just look how much the seat of Black political power has shifted from Harlem to Brooklyn. For example, I mean, and just even broadly, they have the current mayor, the future mayor, the public advocate, the coming controller, the state attorney general, who could be the next governor. There's a tremendous amount of power coming from that borough, and I don't know that he can get away with not doing some, you know, significant patronage just because of the lift he got, particularly from there and Southeast Queens, for example.
And one other thing to keep in mind is what funding is allotted to those agencies, besides who's appointed, but whether or not they will be given sufficient support in terms of staffing to enforce the statutes they're given authority. So we are up to our hour. I want to thank our three panelists for an excellent discussion regarding Eric Adams and his labor policies. We thank you all for joining us. And just to remind everyone that next month, December 7th, we're doing our next Lera chapter meeting on climate change and the impact on workers. Thanks again. Have a good evening. So long.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.